Before we talk about murder, before we talk about blood, before we talk about suspects, let me ask you something. Have you ever felt like someone was watching you, even when you were completely alone? Not a sound, not a shadow, just a feeling, because that feeling is exactly where this story begins. In 1922, on a remote farm in Germany, a family began to realize something terrifying. They were not alone in their own home. And the worst part? Whatever was there was patient. This is the true story of the Hinterkaifeck murders, one of the most disturbing unsolved crimes in history. Not because of how the family died, but because of what happened before they were killed. Hinterkaifeck was not a village. It wasn't even a town. It was a single farmstead, hidden deep in the Bavarian countryside of southern Germany. No Streetlights, no nearby neighbors, only forest, fields, and silence. At night, the darkness here was complete. The kind of darkness where sound travels too far and help never comes in time. This isolation would later become the farm's greatest weakness. The farm was owned by Andreas Gruber, a strict, controlling man in his early 60s. Locals described him as harsh, paranoid, and deeply distrustful of outsiders. He lived there with his wife, Kazilia Gruber, their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, Victoria's 2 young children, and occasionally hired farmhands or maids. From the outside, they looked like a normal rural family. But behind closed doors, things were far from normal. The Gruber household was known for scandal. Rumors circulated throughout nearby villages that Andreas had an inappropriate relationship with his own daughter, Victoria. In fact, Andreas had once been charged with incest years earlier. Though he was convicted, the family returned to the farm, isolated, unwatched, unprotected. This kind of secrecy does something to people. It creates fear, creates enemies, and sometimes creates someone who wants revenge. Months before the murder, the family employed a maid. She didn't last long. After only a short time on the farm, she quit, suddenly terrified. She later told people something chilling. She heard footsteps in the attic at night, slow, heavy, human footsteps. No one else admitted hearing them. Andreas dismissed her fears, but the maid refused to stay. She left and never returned. This would later become one of the most important warnings. In March of 1922, Andreas made a discovery that still haunts investigators. Fresh snow had fallen around the farm, and in that snow, he saw footprints, human footprints. They came from the forest and led directly to the farmhouse. But there were no footprints leading back. Whoever came didn't leave. Andreas searched the property. He found nothing. But from that day forward, his behavior changed. He became anxious, obsessive, afraid. After the footprints appeared, strange things began happening inside the house. A newspaper appeared on the kitchen table. No one in the family subscribed to it. Tools began disappearing, then reappearing in strange places. The house keys went missing entirely. At night, Andreas again heard noises in the attic. Not rats, not animals' footsteps, someone walking slowly, carefully. But Andreas told no one why, because admitting someone might be living in your house means admitting you are powerless, and Andreas Gruber hated that idea. On March 31, 1922, a new maid arrived at Hinterkaifeck. Her name was Maria Baumgartner. It was her first day on the job. She unpacked her belongings, met the family, and settled in. She had no idea she would be dead within hours. That night, life continued as usual. Animals were fed, dinner was eaten. The house went quiet. No screams were heard, no gunshots, no calls for help. Which tells us something important. Whoever attacked the family was not a stranger. The victims followed willingly, and that makes what happened next even more terrifying. Sometime that night, one by one, members of the Gruber family were lured into the barn. Investigators believe they were attacked individually. Each was killed with a mattock, a heavy farming tool. The blows were deliberate, controlled, personal. This was not panic, this was execution. Even the children were not spared. If the story ended here, it would already be horrifying. But this is where Hinterkaifeck becomes something else, because after the murders, the killer did not flee. They stayed. In the days after the murders, smoke was seen rising from the chimney. Animals were fed, food was cooked. Someone was still living on the farm, calmly, comfortably. Surrounded by 6 dead bodies, we will uncover how the killer lived inside the house, why no one noticed, and how police made mistakes that can never be undone, because the most terrifying question is still unanswered: who was already living at Hinterkaifeck before anyone died? After the night of March 31st, 1922, Hinterkaifeck didn't go quiet. Neighbors reported seen smoke rising from the chimney. Animals were being fed. Food was being prepared in the kitchen. The farmhouse lights were on at night. It was as if someone was living there, and the most chilling part, that someone was living among 6 corpses, 6 bodies that had been brutally murdered, and no one noticed. This is not a story about a random stranger. This is a story about control, obsession, and the psychology of someone who knows you too well. Days later, the family didn't appear in the village. Neighbors grew concerned. They decided to investigate. Upon entering the farm, they were greeted with a horrifying sight. The 6 bodies of the Gruber family were stacked in the barn. Each had been killed with extreme precision. Signs of struggle were minimal. It seemed the killer knew the family's habits intimately. Each blow was deliberate, each death intentional. Let's stop for a moment and think like the killer. Imagine living so close to your victims, hearing their routines, watching their habits, and then executing them with surgical precision. This was not a crime of passion. This was a cold, calculated psychological manipulation. The killer had control over the family, over the farm, over the narrative, and for days, even the world outside the farm did not notice. When authorities were finally called, they made critical mistakes. The bodies had been left undisturbed for days, contaminating evidence. Footprints were ignored. Interviews with neighbors were minimal and incomplete. And worst of all, multiple people had the motive and the knowledge to commit the crime, but the investigators failed to narrow it down. Historians and modern analysts have proposed several suspects. Leopold Maria Denner, a distant relative of the family, known to hold grudges.
Josef Reinde,
local worker, possibly obsessed with Victoria Gabriel, had access to the property. Unknown intruder living in the attic. Evidence suggests someone was already living in the house. No one can explain how the killer remained undetected. One of the most terrifying aspects of this crime is the living with the dead theory. After murdering the family, the killer stayed in the house, fed the livestock, prepared meals, walked among the bodies. Imagine the psychological state required to do this. The killer had no remorse,
no urgency,
no fear of being caught. Instead, the murderer watched, controlled, and planned. This behavior has rarely been observed in criminal psychology, and it is one of the reasons this case remains so chilling. Even in 1922, investigators tried to collect evidence: blood spatter patterns, body positioning, footprints inside the house. But the crime scene had already been contaminated. Villagers entered freely. Animals roamed through the property. Weather and exposure altered the scene. Forensic science couldn't solve the mystery. And even today, experts debate: could someone really live undetected with 6 corpses? Was the killer known to the family? Was this the act of one person or a group? Word spread through the village quickly. Fear became pervasive. People stopped visiting the farm. Children were warned to stay away. Local authorities were criticized for negligence. The psychological impact of Hinterkaifeck extended far beyond the family. Everyone in the region now lived in fear, not only of strangers, but of the people they thought they knew. Investigators reported unusual details that made locals suspicious of the supernatural. Tools were found moved in impossible ways. A small set of keys disappeared and reappeared. Strange noises were heard, consistent with someone hiding in the attic. Some villagers began to whisper, "The farm itself is cursed or haunted." Whether you believe in the paranormal or not, the psychological effect of these signs cannot be underestimated. Fear can manipulate perception. Fear can paralyze action. Fear can turn ordinary people into suspects. Let's try to understand the mind of the killer. Calculated, patient, observant, cold-blooded. They were meticulous. They understood the family's daily routines. They exploited isolation in criminal psychology. This is known as organized offender behavior. High intelligence, social control, planning, minimal impulsivity. This person was not a random murderer, they were a predator in their environment. And here's where it gets even darker. Some believe the killer may have lived on the farm for weeks before the murders, slowly integrating themselves into the family's life, learning every routine, studying every weakness. The thought that someone could know you so well and want you dead yet remain undetected is the reason Hinterkaifeck continues to fascinate and terrify historians and true crime fans alike. We will explore the night of the murders in minute-by-minute detail, the killer's exact actions, shocking evidence discovered by investigators, how police completely failed to catch the culprit. March 31st, 1922 evening slowly settled over Hinterkaifeck. Nothing about that night felt unusual. The animals were fed. The barn doors were closed. The air was cold, but calm. Inside the house, the family followed their routine. No arguments were reported. No signs of panic. No screams heard by neighbors. Which tells us something deeply disturbing. Whatever happened was expected. This was not a break in. This was not sudden chaos. The victims trusted the situation enough to step into it willingly. Investigators later reconstructed what likely happened. The killer did not attack everyone at once. They waited patiently. One family member was lured into the barn. Then another. Then another. Each time, the same weapon was used, a mattock, heavy, familiar, already on the property. This was important. The killer didn't bring a weapon. They used what was already there, which suggests comfort with the farm. Inside the barn, investigators found the bodies. Stacked, covered partially with hay. Not hidden, not buried, just placed. This detail matters. Covering the bodies suggests awareness. But not guilt, it suggests containment. Not regret. The killer wasn't trying to escape immediately, they were controlling the scene. This is the part investigators struggled with the most. The children were not killed first. They were not spared, they were brought into the barn like the adults. One of the children showed defensive injuries, fingernail marks. Signs of awareness. This tells us something chilling. At least one victim realized what was happening too late. After killing the adults in the barn, the killer returned to the house. Inside were two more victims. The young maid, Maria Baumgartner. The youngest child, asleep in bed. Both were killed quietly. No struggle, no resistance. The killer moved calmly through the house. This was not a frenzy. This was order. One of the biggest questions in this case is simple. Why did no one hear screams? There are several explanations. The barn was isolated from neighboring farms. The attacks were sudden and fatal. The victims were separated. Fear can silence people faster than pain, and most importantly, the victims trusted whoever led them. Their fear comes later. This is where Hinterkaifeck becomes unique. After killing 6 people, the killer stopped. They did not flee, they did not panic. They stayed for at least 3 days. During those days, animals were fed regularly, food was cooked in the kitchen, the fire was kept burning. The house remained active. This is confirmed by neighbors. This wasn't neglect, this was maintenance. The killer treated the farm as if it were still alive psychologically. This behavior is rare, it suggests emotional detachment, ownership mentality, familiarity. This person did not see themselves as an intruder. They saw themselves as belonging there. Remember the footsteps in the attic after the murders. Those sounds stopped. No more noises. No more movement, because there was no one left to notice them. Many investigators believe the killer had been living in the attic before the murders, watching, listening. Learning routines. Then, when the moment felt right, they acted. When neighbors finally entered the farm, they walked freely through the scene. They touched objects. They moved bodies, they destroyed evidence. This was common practice in 1922, but in this case it guaranteed one thing: the killer would never be caught. The mattock used in the murders belonged to the farm. It was cleaned, placed back where it normally rested. This detail is often overlooked. Cleaning a weapon requires time, and time is something the killer clearly had. Let's pause and think psychologically. This person planned the murders, used a familiar weapon, stayed with the bodies, maintained daily routines, left without urgency. This is not panic behavior. This is ownership behavior. The killer believed they had the right to. Their most murders end with escape. Hinterkaifeck ended with silence. No confession, no arrest, no closure, just a farm that returned to being empty and the feeling that someone walked away unnoticed. But here's where the story takes its darkest turn. The strongest suspects, their motives, their alibis, and one suspect in particular who may have had every reason and every opportunity to commit these murders. And when you hear that theory, you may realize something terrifying. The killer may not have been hiding in the attic. They may have been standing in plain sight after the bodies were discovered, after the crime scene was Destroyed after the farm fell silent again, only one question remained. Who would do this and why? Police had theories, villagers had suspicions, but no one had proof, so let's do what investigators couldn't do properly in 1922. Let's slow down and look at the suspects. Andreas Gruber was not a likable man. He was controlling, violent, feared by his family and neighbors. Many villagers had reasons to hate him, but here's the problem. Backhand index pointing right, Andreas was one of the victims. And while some believe the murders were revenge doesn't explain the children, revenge doesn't explain the maid, revenge doesn't explain staying in the house afterward. This was not a message. This was something deeper. Victoria Gabriel's life was surrounded by tragedy. Her husband died in World War. She returned to live under her father's control. And then came the rumors. Some believed Victoria's youngest child was actually fathered by Andreas Gruber. This created scandal, shame, and resentment. But Victoria was also a victim. And nothing about her life suggests she could orchestrate a massacre of her own family. Attacker possibilities included a former soldier suffering from trauma, a drifter hiding in the forest, someone living secretly in the attic. This theory explains the footsteps. The attic noises, the lack of escape footprints, but it fails in one key area. Knowledge. The killer knew the families routines too well. They knew when people would be alone. They knew where tools were kept. This was not someone unfamiliar. This was someone comfortable. One of the strangest theories involves Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel. Officially, he died in World War I, but some villagers claimed they saw him years later. If Carl had survived the war, returned secretly, and discovered the truth about the child, could this have been revenge? It's a haunting theory, but there is no concrete evidence. Only rumors. One name appears again and again: Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor, a regular visitor, and possibly the most suspicious figure in this case. He had a relationship with Victoria. Some believe he may have been the father of her child. He knew the farm well, he knew the layout, he knew the routines, and when the family disappeared, he was one of the first to investigate. Schlittenbauer's behavior raised eyebrows. He entered the farm alone, he moved bodies. He claimed not to be afraid. He allegedly knew where the bodies were. He even unlocked the house with a key that was supposed to be missing. When questioned, he denied involvement, but suspicion never left him. From a psychological perspective, Schlittenbauer fits many criteria: familiarity with the victims, possible emotional motive, comfort inside the crime scene, no visible fear. But psychology is not proof, and without forensic evidence the case stalled. Hinterkaifeck was doomed from the start. No proper crime scene control, no fingerprint analysis, no DNA technology. Witness contamination. Modern experts agree. Backhand index pointing right. Even today, this case would be difficult to solve. Backhand index pointing right. In 1922, it was nearly impossible. The killer didn't need to be smart. They just needed time. Months later, the Hinterkaifeck farm was demolished. The land was cleared, almost as if someone wanted to erase what happened there. But history doesn't forget. Decades later, investigators reopened the case. Files were reviewed, theories reanalyzed. But no conclusion was reached. Every path ended the same way, with silence. Here's the theory that haunts people the most. What if the killer was not hiding in the attic? What if they were already trusted, already welcomed, already part of the family's world? Someone who didn't need to sneak in because they were already inside. Criminal psychologists warn us about something important: the most dangerous threats rarely come from strangers. They come from people who know your habits, understand your weaknesses, have emotional access. Hinterkaifeck may not be a story about mystery, it may be a story about denial. This case refuses to rest because it attacks a basic human belief that home is safe, that familiarity means protection. Hinterkaifeck proves the opposite. Today, nothing stands where the farm once existed. No house, no barn, no bodies, only open land. And a story that refuses to die. Somewhere in history, a killer lived among their victims, ate their food, fed their animals, slept under their roof, and walked away unpunished, unseen, and maybe never suspected. So now I ask you, do you believe the killer was hiding in the attic or standing in plain sight? Because sometimes the most terrifying monsters don't hide in the dark, they live next door.